The ringed city holds secrets that were never supposed to be found. This is the story of forbidden knowledge, buried at the edge of existence by gods who feared what humanity might become. When the first flame ignited and brought disparity into a world of eternal grey, 4 beings claimed the Lord's souls that burned within it. History remembers 3 of them clearly. Gwyn took the soul of light and became the Lord of Sunlight. Nito claimed the soul of the dead. The Witch of Izalith took mastery over life and flame. These 3 would wage war against the everlasting dragons and build the Age of Fire from the ashes of their victory. But there was a 4th, a small figure so easily forgotten that history would barely acknowledge his existence. The furtive pygmy claimed the dark soul, an essence tied to the shadows that light creates, and what he did with that power would terrify the gods more than any dragon ever could. He divided it. The pygmy took his dark soul and split it into countless fragments. Then he dispersed those fragments among his descendants, spreading the power of a Lord's soul across many instead of hoarding it for himself. This act created humanity. Every single human being that would ever exist carries a tiny piece of the dark soul inside them. The furtive pygmy did not just claim power, he became the ancestor of an entire race. This was the terrifying truth that Gwyn recognized early on. The other Lord's souls were finite. When Gwyn shared his power, each piece he gave away made him weaker. But the dark soul worked differently. It could be split infinitely and still retain its potency. Each human born with a fragment added to the total. As humanity spread and multiplied, the collective power of the dark soul grew larger and larger. Given enough time, the accumulated fragments scattered across humanity could rival or even surpass the power of the gods themselves. And there was more. The humans who carried these fragments discovered they could tap into something called the Abyss, that primordial darkness that existed as the opposite of flame. They forged weapons that blazed with dark flame. They crafted armor infused with shadow. These were not weak imitations of divine equipment. The dark forged arms of humanity were powerful enough to harm creatures that had existed since before the first flame ignited. When the war against the dragons began, the gods did not fight alone. Ancient humans stood beside them on the battlefield. Warriors wearing dark infused equipment fought alongside Gwyn's knights against the everlasting dragons. Some of these human soldiers became known as the Ringed Knights. They wielded swords that blazed with abyssal flame and wore distinctive armor marked by rings of fire. They charged into battle against immortal creatures and made a difference. Their contributions helped turn the tide of the war. But when the histories were written, something strange happened. The gods struck every mention of human participation from the records. The stories that survived spoke only of divine triumph. Gwyn and his lightning, Nito and his decay, the witch and her flames. The humans who had bled and fought were erased completely. Their armor was forgotten. Their sacrifices were ignored. Why would Gwyn erase the contributions of his own allies? Because he saw what humanity could become. He recognized that humans carried power that could grow without limit. He understood that the dark soul represented a threat that no lightning spear could destroy. The pygmies were potential rivals to the gods themselves, and Gwyn could not allow that future to exist. But he couldn't just destroy them either. The war had just ended. The pygmies had fought on his side. Openly attacking his former allies would destabilize the new order he was trying to build. He needed a different solution, a way to contain the dark soul and its bearers without appearing to persecute them. The Ringed City was that solution. Gwyn created a prison disguised as a gift. He offered the Pygmy Lords a grand city at the literal edge of the world, far from Anor Londo and the centers of divine power. The city itself was a marvel of architecture, with great walls rising in a perfect circle around the settlement. Inside the ring, the humans could live as they pleased. Outside the ring was a world that would slowly forget they existed. Gwyn presented this arrangement as an honor, a reward for their service in the war. The pygmies would have their own kingdom, their own domain where they could rule according to their traditions. What greater reward could a vassal hope for than a city of their own? But Gwyn knew the pygmies might not accept this gift at face value. They could see that being sent to the edge of existence meant being removed from influence. They might suspect the honor was actually exile. So Gwyn added something to the arrangement that no one expected. He sent his own daughter. Princess Filianor was the youngest of Gwyn's children. She was beloved by her father, gentle in nature, and represented everything the gods claimed to value. By sending her to the ringed city, Gwyn placed his own flesh among the pygmies. He was trusting them with someone precious to him. Filianor arrived as a symbol of peace and protection. Her presence told the pygmy lords that Gwyn was not abandoning them. Before she departed, Gwyn made Filianor a vow. He promised that he would come for her when the day came. He assured her that this separation was temporary. Someday, when the time was right, her father would return and bring her home. Filianor believed him. The pygmy lords believed him. They were all wrong. Gwyn had no intention of ever returning for his daughter. She was a tool for control, nothing more. Her presence gave him a permanent connection to the place. The promise he made to her was hollow from the moment he spoke it. Filianor would wait at the edge of the world, century after century, for a father who would never come. With the pact established and Filianor installed in the ringed city, Gwyn moved to the final phase of his plan. He erased them. The pygmy lords and their people disappeared from the records of history. The ringed knights who had charged into battle with weapons blazing with abyssal flame were struck from every story and chronicle. The very existence of the furtive pygmy became forbidden knowledge. He became simply the furtive one, the forgotten one, so easily overlooked that history itself seemed to lose track of him. This erasure was deliberate and thorough. Gwyn wanted the world to forget that humans carried fragments of a lord's soul. He wanted everyone to believe that humanity was a lesser race, created to serve the gods. The truth about the dark soul was locked away along with the pygmies who carried it. For ages, this worked exactly as Gwyn intended. Humans lived their lives without knowing where they truly came from. They worshipped the gods without realizing they carried power that could challenge everything. The ringed city became a myth, then a legend, then something most people did not believe existed at all. But secrets have a way of surviving even the most thorough attempts to destroy them. A being called Darkstalker Cath remembered the truth. This primordial serpent held knowledge that Gwyn wanted buried. Cath knew about the furtive pygmy and the prophecy that terrified the Lord of Sunlight, a prophecy of an age of dark, when the first flame would fade and humanity would inherit the world. An age led by a figure called the Dark Lord, a human powerful enough to claim what Gwyn had stolen from them. Gwyn had taken his former allies and locked them away at the edge of reality. He had taken his own daughter and left her among people he intended to forget. He had taken the truth about humanity and buried it so deep that centuries would pass before anyone uncovered it again. The ringed city stood at the end of the world, beautiful and isolated, holding the most dangerous secret in existence. The pygmy lords accepted their fate. They took their place in the city at the edge of the world. They believed they were being honored for their service. They did not realize they were being removed from history itself, confined to a place where their power could never challenge the Age of Fire. But power contained is not power destroyed. The dark soul still burned within the ringed city's walls, and the pygmy lords were about to make the best of their exile, building a civilization that would outlast the gods who imprisoned them. The Pygmy lords made the best of their exile. They built a civilization that would last for ages. Inside those ringed walls, far from the throne of sunlight and the politics of gods, the descendants of the furtive Pygmy established their own form of government. Multiple lords ruled together as an oligarchy, sharing power among themselves. Each of these lords carried a significant portion of the dark soul within them, making them the closest thing humanity had to royalty. They were the ruling family of an entire race, governing from a city that the rest of the world would slowly forget existed. The arrangement worked surprisingly well. The Pygmy lords divided responsibilities and territories among themselves. They settled disputes through council, not conflict. They built institutions and traditions that would endure across centuries. In many ways, the ringed city became a more stable realm than the divine kingdoms that surrounded it. The lords did not fight each other for dominance because they understood that cooperation kept their isolated society functioning. But political structure alone could not sustain a people cut off from the rest of the world. The Pygmies needed something to believe in. They needed hope that their exile had meaning, that their patience would eventually be rewarded. They found that hope in the most unlikely source. Filianore became the center of their faith. The princess who had arrived as her father's tool for control transformed into something far more significant in the eyes of the Pygmies. They saw her not as a hostage or a watchful eye, but as a divine protector sent to guard them. Her presence meant that the gods had not truly abandoned them. Her gentleness suggested that the covenant between their peoples might still hold meaning. The Pygmies chose to interpret Filianore's exile alongside them as a blessing, not a curse. They built a grand church in her honor at the heart of the city. This church of Filianore became the spiritual center of the ringed city, a cathedral dedicated to the princess who slumbered within its walls. At the center of this holy place, Filianore rested on a bed, cradling a strange cracked egg in her arms, seemingly asleep for eternity. The Pygmies worshipped her. They revered her as their guardian deity, even though she held no political power. They entrusted their deepest hopes to her care, believing that as long as Filianore remained with them, the promise of the gods remained intact. Their faith was genuine and touching. These people who had been exiled to the edge of existence found comfort in believing that a gentle princess watched over them. A phrase emerged that captured Filianore's role perfectly. She slumbered for the sake of man. Everything about her presence, her church, her endless sleep was understood to be for the benefit of the Pygmies. She was their protector, their connection to the divine, their assurance that they had not been forgotten. The phrase became a prayer, a comfort, a statement of faith that sustained the ringed city through ages of waiting. And they did wait. Century after century, the Pygmies maintained their end of the pact with Gwyn. They stayed within their walls. They did not venture out into the wider world. They did not seek to spread their dark soul or challenge the supremacy of the gods. They remained passive and obedient, trusting that eventually the Lord of Sunlight would return for his daughter and bring them back into the fold of civilization. This patience was possible because of something unique to the Pygmies. The dark soul granted them extraordinary longevity. The fragments of that primordial soul did not just give humans power. They gave them persistence. The dark soul had a life-giving quality that allowed humanity's essence to endure far beyond normal limits. While ordinary beings aged, those who carried strong connections to the dark soul could persist for ages. The Pygmy lords, who bore the largest fragments, were effectively ageless. They could be harmed, they could fall in battle, but simple time could not claim them. This is why the same Pygmy lords who had accepted Gwyn's pact in the early days of the Age of Fire were still alive countless years later. They had waited through the rise and fall of civilizations in the outside world. They had watched the first flame grow strong and begin to waver without ever leaving their city. They had maintained their vigil beside Filianor's church, trusting that someday their patience would be vindicated. The nature of this persistence would later become the foundation of something terrible. The same life-giving quality of the dark soul that allowed the pygmies to live for ages would eventually manifest in the outside world as the undead curse. Humans who could not stay gone, beings who returned from the brink over and over, slowly losing themselves with each resurrection. The root of that curse lay in the very thing that made the pygmies immortal within their ringed walls. But inside the city, surrounded by their faith in Filianor, the pygmies experienced their persistence as a gift. They used their long lives to build, to create, to develop traditions that spanned centuries. The ringed city became rich with culture and history, even as it remained hidden from the rest of the world. The delicate balance held. The Age of Fire continued to burn in the outside world, while the pygmies waited in their isolated kingdom. Filianor slumbered for the sake of man. The pygmy lords governed with wisdom accumulated across lifetimes. The church stood at the center of the city, a monument to faith that had endured since the earliest days of Gwyn's reign. Generations passed outside the walls, but inside the ringed city, time moved differently. The same faces appeared in the same halls year after year. The same lords debated the same questions in councils that had been meeting since before most civilizations were born. The same princess slept in her church, clutching that cracked egg, dreaming whatever dreams kept her in endless repose. The pygmies had no way of knowing that Gwyn would never return. They had no way of knowing that the god who had promised to come back for his daughter had already sacrificed himself to fuel the first flame. They simply waited, faithful and patient, trusting in a covenant that had been broken before it was ever signed. This is the tragedy of the ringed city. Not that it was a prison, though it was. Not that its people were forgotten, though they were. The real tragedy is that the pygmies genuinely believed in the arrangement. They made it work. They built a functioning society, a rich culture, a genuine faith around their situation. They deserved better than what Gwyn gave them. They deserved better than empty promises and deliberate forgetting. But they made the best of what they had, and for ages upon ages, the kingdom at world's end endured in peaceful isolation. The pygmy lords sat on their thrones. Filianor slumbered in her church. The dark soul pulsed quietly within the ringed walls, and the Age of Fire burned on outside, slowly consuming itself without anyone inside the city, realizing that the flame they were waiting to welcome them back was already beginning to fade. Filianor's slumber was not just rest. It was magic that bent the rules of reality itself. At some point during the long ages of waiting, the princess fell into a sleep so deep that it seemed more like a trance than simple rest. She lay upon her bed in the inner sanctum of the church, arms wrapped around that cracked egg-shaped shell, and she did not wake. Days passed, then weeks, then years, then centuries. Filianor remained in repose, her expression peaceful, her grip on the strange object never loosening. The pygmies did not understand what was happening at first. They worried about their guardian. They prayed over her still form. But gradually they began to notice something extraordinary about the city itself. Time was behaving strangely within the ringed walls. Outside in the wider world, seasons changed and kingdoms rose and fell. The first flame continued to burn, though it grew weaker with each passing cycle. The Age of Fire progressed through its slow decline, and the lands beyond the ringed city began to show signs of decay. Structures crumbled, civilizations collapsed. But inside the ringed city, none of this happened. The buildings did not decay. The people did not age beyond what they already were. The sky remained frozen in a perpetual twilight, neither brightening toward dawn nor darkening toward night. It was as if someone had taken a single moment and stretched it across eternity, preserving everything exactly as it was. The source of this preservation was Filianore herself. Her enchanted sleep had created something that defied normal understanding. The cracked egg she cradled was the focus of an immense magical working, a spell that wrapped around the entire city and held it separate from the flow of time outside. As long as Filianore slept, as long as she held that shell in her arms, the ringed city existed in its own bubble of reality. The decay that consumed the outer world could not touch it. This was Filianore's true gift to the pygmies. Whether she intended it or not, her slumber had become the shield that protected everything within the ringed walls. The dark soul remained contained not just by physical barriers but by temporal ones. The pygmy lords lived on not just because of their own longevity, but because the city itself refused to let time pass normally. The pygmies came to understand this gradually. They realized that their guardian was not simply sleeping. She was holding back the end of the world. Every moment she remained in repose was another moment the Age of Dark could not begin within their walls. Her dream was their salvation, keeping them safe from the apocalypse that was slowly consuming everything outside. This gave the phrase they already used a deeper meaning. Filianore truly did slumber for the sake of man. Her sleep was not passive. It was active protection, a continuous act of preservation that kept the ringed city intact while the rest of reality decayed around it. But such powerful magic came with vulnerability. If anything disrupted Filianore's sleep, the spell would break. Time would catch up to the ringed city all at once. Centuries of decay that had been held at bay would crash down in an instant. Everything the pygmies had built would crumble into the ash that it should have become long ago. The pygmy lords understood this danger clearly. They needed guardians who would stand between the princess and anyone who might disturb her. And so they created the Spears of the Church. This was an order of elite knights sworn to a sacred covenant. Those who joined took on the most important duty in the entire ringed city. They would protect Filianore. They would guard her chamber against any intruder. They would ensure that no one, for any reason, ever touched the princess or the shell she held. The Spears trained constantly for a battle that might never come. They developed techniques specifically designed for the narrow corridors around Filianore's sanctum. They armed themselves with weapons blessed by the faith that had grown around the sleeping princess. And they waited, ready to respond the moment any threat appeared. Each member of the order received recognition for their service. Filianore's spear ornament became the symbol of their covenant, a token awarded to those who fulfilled their duty successfully. These ornaments accumulated over the ages, marking countless successful defenses of the princess. The charge of the spears was twofold. First, they had to prevent anyone from reaching Filianore and waking her. This meant stopping intruders at the gates, hunting them through the city streets, and making a final stand in the church itself if all other defenses failed. Second, the spears had to ensure that the dark soul remained contained within the city. The magical barrier worked both ways. It kept the decay out, but it also kept the darkness in. If anyone broke the spell, the dark soul that had been locked away might escape into the wider world. The spears guarded against both outcomes. These knights became the eternal watchdogs of a fragile peace. They patrolled the approaches to the church. They questioned anyone who seemed too curious about the inner sanctum. They trained new recruits to replace members who fell or went hollow over the long years. The order sustained itself across countless generations, always ready, always vigilant, always prepared to give everything to protect their sleeping goddess. Some spears served for decades, others for centuries. The longest serving among them had been guarding Filianor since shortly after she first fell asleep, their own agelessness allowing them to maintain an unbroken vigil that spanned more time than most civilizations exist. The world outside continued to change. The first flame weakened and was relinked over and over by heroes who sacrificed themselves to delay the Age of Dark. The lands that Gwyn had once ruled transformed beyond recognition. Entire kingdoms rose from nothing, flourished for a time, and then collapsed into ruin without anyone in the ringed city even knowing they existed. Through it all, Filianor slept. Through it all, the spears watched. Through it all, the city remained frozen in its eternal twilight. A bubble of preserved time floating at the edge of a world that was slowly dying. The promise that Gwyn had made hung over everything like a ghost. He had said he would return. He never did. He never would. But in a strange way, his absence did not matter as much as it should have. Filianor's magic had replaced his promise with something more reliable. The princess herself had become the protection she was supposed to symbolize. Her sleep was the covenant now, written not in words but in enchantment. The pygmies lived on in their preserved city, waiting for something they no longer truly expected. The spears defended a princess who never stirred, and somewhere in the depths of her dreams, Filianor continued the work she may never have consciously chosen, holding back the tide of time for the sake of the humans she had been sent to watch over. The ringed knights had every reason to hate Gwyn. Instead, they served him until the very end. These warriors had charged into battle against the dragons with weapons blazing with abyssal flame. They had stood shoulder to shoulder with divine knights, fighting for a cause they believed in. And when the war ended in victory, they received no glory, no recognition, no place in the songs that celebrated the triumph. Their names were scrubbed from every record while the gods claimed all the credit. But the erasure from history was not the worst thing Gwyn did to them. After the war, Gwyn looked at the ringed knights and saw a problem that needed solving. These human warriors had demonstrated what the dark soul could do when channeled through weapons and armor. They had proven that humans wielding abyssal power could stand against creatures that had existed since before time began. They had shown Gwyn exactly how dangerous humanity could become if left unchecked. So he marked them. By decree of the gods, the ringed knights were branded with a seal of fire burned directly into their very essence. This was a magical brand that reached into the core of what they were and placed a ring of flame around the darkness within them. The fire encircled the dark, constraining it, limiting it, preventing it from reaching its full potential. This brand became known as the Dark Sign. The Dark Sign did something terrible to the humans who bore it. It crippled their connection to the Dark Soul. The power that should have grown and multiplied within them was instead contained by that ring of flame. The potential that Gwyn feared so much was locked away, sealed behind a barrier of fire that prevented it from ever fully manifesting. In practical terms, the Dark Sign made humans mortal in a way they had not been before. It limited their ability to tap into the abyssal forces that had made the ringed knights so formidable in battle. It turned what could have been an unstoppable force into something manageable, something controllable, something that would never threaten divine supremacy. The ringed knights bore the evidence of this branding on their physical forms. Their armor was charred black, marked by rings of fire that glowed even when the metal should have been cool. Their arms showed the same pattern. Circles of flame burned into their very bodies. Anyone who looked at them could see immediately that they had been branded, that they belonged to Gwyn in a way that went deeper than simple loyalty. This was humiliation masquerading as honor. The gods presented the Dark Sign as a gift, a blessing that connected humanity to the divine flame. In reality, it was a chain. It was Gwyn's way of ensuring that the humans who had helped him win the war could never challenge his authority afterward. And here is the strangest part of this story. The ringed knights accepted it. Despite everything that had been done to them, despite the erasure and the branding and the exile to the edge of the world, the ringed knights remained loyal to the gods. They did not rebel. They did not seek revenge. They did not use their remaining power to tear down the system that had treated them so poorly. Instead, they continued to serve. Within the ringed city, the ringed knights became the standing army that protected the pygmy lords and maintained order. They patrolled the streets in their distinctive charred armor. They guarded the walls against any threat that might approach from outside. They stood ready to defend their city and their people against anything that might disturb the fragile peace. Their weapons still blazed with abyssal flame, despite the limitations the dark sign placed on them. They had retained enough of their connection to the dark to channel it through their swords and spears, creating weapons that burned with a fire that was neither truly light nor truly dark, but something in between. These weapons made them formidable warriors even in their diminished state. The discipline of the ringed knights was remarkable. Other humans who drew too deeply on the power of the abyss eventually lost themselves to it, becoming twisted creatures called dark wraiths who cared only for consuming humanity. The ringed knights lived in constant proximity to that same darkness, yet never succumbed. They maintained their sanity, their purpose, their loyalty across ages that would have broken lesser beings. Part of this was the dark sign itself, which acted as a buffer between the knights and the worst influences of the abyss. Part of it was the discipline they had developed during the Dragon War, the mental fortitude that allowed them to channel darkness without being consumed by it. And part of it may have been simple pride, a refusal to become the monsters that Gwyn had implied they could be. The ringed knights became the eternal watchdogs of the Forbidden City. They enforced the containment that kept the dark soul locked away at the edge of the world. They protected the pygmy lords who ruled in their isolated kingdom. They stood guard outside the church of Filianor, adding another layer of defense to the sleeping princess. They did all of this despite knowing what Gwyn had done to them. They served despite the brand. They protected despite the erasure. They remained faithful despite every betrayal. Why? Perhaps they understood that their situation could have been worse. Gwyn could have simply destroyed them after the war. Perhaps they believed faithful service would eventually be rewarded. Perhaps they had no other purpose left. Or perhaps they served because they loved their people. The ringed knights were protectors of their own kind. Every human in the ringed city was their kin, their responsibility. Whatever resentment they felt toward Gwyn, they directed their energy into keeping their fellow pygmies safe. The charred black armor became a symbol throughout the ringed city. When the people saw ringed knights patrolling their streets, they felt secure. The knights who had been branded and forgotten became the heroes of a city that the rest of the world did not remember existed. This is perhaps the greatest irony of the ringed city's story. The warriors marked as dangerous, sealed away because Gwyn feared what they might become, turned out to be the most loyal servants the gods ever had. They followed orders, even when those orders came from someone who had wronged them. The dark sign that Gwyn intended as a limitation became something else within the ringed walls. It became a badge of service, a mark of dedication, proof that these knights had accepted their role and would fulfill it no matter the cost. For ages upon ages, the ringed knights maintained their vigil. They aged slowly thanks to the dark soul within them and the enchantment that preserved the city. They trained new generations to take up the same duty. They passed down techniques and traditions that stretched back to the Dragon War itself. And they waited, always ready, for threats that rarely came to a city that most of the world had forgotten. The forgotten heroes of a forgotten war. standing guard over a forgotten city, protecting a people who had been deliberately erased from history. That was the fate of the Ringed Knights, and they accepted it with a dignity that Gwyn never deserved from them. Gwyn needed something that could fight the darkness forever, so he turned to the very creatures he had nearly exterminated. After the war that ended the Age of Ancients, most dragons were gone, but not every dragon perished. A few were spared, either because they could not be found or because they served a purpose. Dark Eater Midir was one of these survivors. He was a descendant of the ancient archdragons, those immortal beings who had ruled the world before the first flame ignited. Like his ancestors, Midir possessed the draconic immortality that made dragons so difficult to destroy. He did not age. He did not weaken over time. Gwyn saw potential in this dragon. Not a threat to be eliminated, but a tool to be used. The gods took Midir and raised him for a singular purpose. From the earliest days he could remember, Midir was trained to do one thing: hunt the darkness, consume the abyss. Wherever the primordial shadow manifested, wherever the power of the dark soul leaked into the world, Midir would find it and devour it. He would be a living weapon against the very force that Gwyn feared most. This was Midir's divine mandate. Gwyn himself tasked the dragon with being a bulwark against the abyss, not just a defender who would stand between the darkness and the world, but an active hunter who would seek out abyssal corruption and eliminate it at the source. The dragon would literally eat the darkness, consuming manifestations of the abyss to prevent them from spreading. This earned him the name that would follow him through ages: Dark Eater, the dragon who fed on shadows, the beast whose purpose was to swallow the very essence of the dark soul wherever it appeared. Midir's immortality made him perfect for this assignment. The fight against the abyss was not something that could be won in a single battle or a single lifetime. It was an eternal struggle that would continue as long as the dark soul existed. Any mortal guardian would eventually weaken, age, and pass on. But a dragon could fight forever. Midir could patrol the darkness for centuries, for millennia, never tiring, never failing, never needing to be replaced. The gods stationed Midir at the place where his duties would be most critical: the Ringed City. This made perfect sense from Gwyn's perspective. The Ringed City contained the highest concentration of the dark soul in the entire world. The Pygmy Lords and their people carried fragments of that primordial power. The very foundations of the city were steeped in abyssal energy. If the darkness was going to manifest anywhere, if the abyss was going to break through into the world, this was where it would happen. Midir took up his position in the canyons and chasms beneath the city's outskirts. He lurked in the darkness below the ringed walls, prowling through the shadows that pooled at the edge of existence. His presence added another layer of defense to a city that was already protected by the spears of the church, the Ringed Knights, and Filianor's enchanted sleep. But Midir's role was different from the other guardians. The spears protected Filianor from intruders. The Ringed Knights maintained order in the streets. Midir hunted the darkness itself. He was not guarding against people or armies. He was guarding against the abyss, that formless corruption that could seep through cracks in reality and corrupt everything it touched. An ancient agreement bound Midir to this duty. The Old Accord, it was called. A pact between Gwyn and the dragon that had been established in the earliest days of the Age of Fire. The exact terms were lost to time, but the essence was clear. Midir would protect the Ringed City and the sleeping princess within it. He would consume any darkness that threatened to escape from its containment. In exchange, he received his continued existence and perhaps something more that no record preserved. True to this accord, Midir remained at his post even after everything else changed. Gwyn departed the world when he sacrificed himself to fuel the first flame. His children scattered or fell. The other lords faded into obscurity or succumbed to their own catastrophes. The divine order that had established Midir's mission crumbled piece by piece over countless ages. Kingdoms rose and fell in the lands beyond the ringed city. The first flame was relinked again and again by heroes who came after Gwyn. The world transformed beyond recognition. Midir did not forget. Long after the gods who had given him his purpose were gone, the dragon continued to patrol the darkness. He hunted abyssal manifestations with the same dedication he had shown when Gwyn was still alive. He guarded the approaches to the ringed city with the same vigilance he had maintained since the earliest days. The accord had not specified an end date. The duty had not come with an expiration. So Midir continued, century after century, fulfilling a mission that no longer had anyone to report to. This is perhaps the strangest aspect of Midir's story. The dragon was not serving out of fear of punishment. There was no longer anyone to punish him if he abandoned his post. He was not serving for reward. There was no one left to reward him. He served because serving was what he had been made to do. His entire identity had been shaped around this single purpose, and without it, he would have had nothing. The Dark Eater became a legend even within the ringed city itself. The people who lived behind the walls knew that something guarded the darkness below. They heard roars echoing up from the canyons. They saw shadows move in ways that suggested something massive prowling just out of sight. Only a few knew the truth about Midir. Shira, Knight of Filianor, had met the dragon and understood his purpose. She recognized him as a faithful guardian who had served longer than anyone should have been asked to serve. Midir prowled the darkness beneath the ringed city for ages beyond counting. He consumed whatever abyssal corruption he found, preventing it from spreading upward into the city proper. He watched for intruders who might disturb the fragile peace that Filianor's sleep maintained. He remained true to the old accord, even when there was no one left who remembered making it. The dragon, who could have been an enemy, became the most reliable guardian the ringed city ever had. Gwyn's decision to spare and raise Midir had paid off in ways that outlasted Gwyn himself. The immortal hunter continued his work in the shadows, eating darkness, protecting the city, fulfilling a duty that had become his entire reason for existing. But there was a cost to consuming so much of the abyss, a price that Midir was paying slowly, century by century, without anyone noticing until it was almost too late. The darkness he swallowed did not disappear. Some of it remained inside him, accumulating, corrupting, changing the dragon in ways that would eventually threaten everything he was sworn to protect. That corruption was already beginning when the final ages of the world approached the ringed city, and the faithful guardian who had served so long and so well was slowly becoming the very thing he had been created to destroy. The ringed city was not the only place where the abyss had shown its terrible potential. Long before the final ages of the world, another kingdom had learned what happens when darkness is disturbed. Olasil was a human realm known for beauty and magical achievement. Its sorcerers practiced arts that drew on light itself, weaving spells that shimmered with golden radiance. The kingdom flourished during the Age of Fire, building towers and gardens that seemed to glow from within. While other human lands worshipped the gods from afar, Olasil had developed its own tradition of illumination magic that made it unique among mortal civilizations. The people of Olasil believed they understood the nature of light and darkness. They studied these forces with the confidence of scholars who had mastered their subjects. They thought themselves wise enough to handle powers that others feared to approach. They were wrong. A serpent came to Olasil with whispers and suggestions. This was Darkstalker Kath, the same being who had once tempted the four kings of New Londo into embracing the abyss. Cath moved through history like a shadow, appearing wherever he saw opportunity to advance the coming of the Age of Dark. In Ulasil, he found people who were curious enough to listen and arrogant enough to act on what they heard. Cath told them about a grave buried deep beneath their kingdom. Inside that grave rested someone called the Primeval Man, a being from the earliest days of humanity. The serpent suggested that this ancient figure held secrets worth uncovering. He implied that great power awaited anyone brave enough to disturb that resting place. The people of Ulasil dug. What they unearthed was not treasure or knowledge. It was Manus, father of the abyss. This being had been sleeping in darkness for ages beyond counting, his power dormant but not gone. The moment Ulasil's sorcerers broke into his grave, that power woke with fury that defied description. Manus erupted from his prison in a storm of pure abyss. The darkness that poured from him was not metaphorical. It was physical, tangible, a force that warped everything it touched. The golden light of Ulasil's magic flickered and died as shadows swept through the kingdom. Buildings twisted into nightmarish shapes. The very ground became unstable, sinking into pools of darkness that seemed to have no bottom. The people suffered worst of all. The abyss didn't kill them, it transformed them. Citizens who had been ordinary humans twisted into monsters, driven mad by the darkness flooding their minds. Friends attacked friends. Families tore each other apart. The kingdom that had prided itself on understanding light now became a place where sanity itself was devoured by shadow. Ulasil fell in what felt like moments. The civilization that had taken generations to build collapsed in days. By the time the darkness finished spreading, almost nothing remained of what the kingdom had been. Only ruins and monsters marked where a proud human realm had once stood. This catastrophe would later be remembered as a warning about the dangers of the abyss. The dark was not just a force to be studied or controlled. It was something that could consume entire civilizations if given the chance to spread unchecked. One person who survived the fall of Ulasil would carry that lesson forward through the ages. Half-Light was a sorcerer who had practiced the light magic that Ulasil was famous for. He had walked the gleaming streets before the darkness came. He had studied in the towers where illumination spells were crafted with precision and care. He had believed, like his fellow citizens, that knowledge could protect them from any danger. Then Manus rose from his grave, and Half-Light watched everything he knew get swallowed by shadow. He saw the abyss pour through Ulasil like a flood with no end. He witnessed his neighbors transform into twisted creatures that no longer recognized their own names. He felt the golden light of his homeland extinguish as darkness claimed every corner of the kingdom. The experience carved itself into his soul with wounds that would never fully heal. Somehow, Half-Light escaped the destruction. The most likely explanation is that he was undead, one of the humans branded with the dark sign, who could not truly perish no matter what horrors they endured. His curse became his salvation, allowing him to survive long after Ulasil itself had become nothing but a memory of what unchecked darkness could accomplish. But survival brought its own burden. Half-Light could not simply move on and forget what he had witnessed. The fall of Ulasil had shown him something that changed how he understood the world. The abyss was not a theoretical danger or a distant threat. It was a force that could erase civilizations in days if given the opportunity. And as long as the dark soul existed, as long as humans carried fragments of that primordial power within them, the potential for another Ulasil remained. Half-Light became a missionary in the years that followed. He traveled from land to land, spreading teachings about the gods and the dangers of darkness. His purpose was not simply religious devotion. It was prevention. Every lesson he shared, every warning he delivered, was an attempt to ensure that no other kingdom would make the same mistake Ulasil had made. His journeys eventually brought him to knowledge of the Ringed City. Here was a place where the dark soul itself was contained. Here was a princess who slumbered eternally to keep that darkness sealed away from the world. Here was a sacred duty that aligned perfectly with everything Half-Light had come to believe after watching his homeland fall. If he wanted to prevent another Ulasil, protecting Filianor was the most important thing he could possibly do. Half-Light made his choice without hesitation. He would stay in the Ringed City. He would dedicate whatever remained of his existence to guarding the princess whose sleep held back the darkness. He would become one of the defenders who ensured that the abyss contained within these walls never escaped to consume another kingdom. The survivor of Ulasil found purpose in the Ringed City. His trauma became fuel for devotion. The memory of what darkness had done to his people transformed into resolve to prevent it from happening again. Half-Light took his place among the guardians of Filianor, bringing with him first-hand knowledge of why their duty mattered so much. He had seen the worst the abyss could do. He had survived when his entire civilization did not, and he would spend the rest of his undying existence making sure that the darkness sealed in the Ringed City never got the chance to repeat what it had done to Ulasil. The missionary who had wandered so far from his ruined homeland finally found a cause worth dying for, or in his case, worth living forever for. The protection of Filianor became his sacred purpose, and he embraced it with the fervor of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. The Ringed City existed outside of time. The rest of the world was not so fortunate. Picture two realities running parallel to each other. Inside Filianor's enchanted bubble, nothing changed. The same twilight hung over the same streets where the same pygmy lords walked the same paths they had walked for ages. Outside that bubble, civilizations were born and buried. Wars were fought and forgotten. The very land itself shifted and cracked as the power holding everything together slowly drained away. The first flame was dying. It had been dying since the moment Gwyn threw himself into it. That first sacrifice had bought the world time, but time was all it had bought. The flame that Gwyn fed with his own soul burned bright for a while, then began to dim just as it had before. The fuel ran out, the light weakened, and the world faced the same choice it had faced when Gwyn made his decision. Link the fire again, or let it die. Heroes rose to answer that question across the ages. The chosen undead prophesied to inherit Gwyn's legacy. The bearer of the curse, who walked through lands already crumbling. Each generation produced someone capable of reaching the flame and making the choice that would determine what came next. Some chose to link. They sacrificed themselves just as Gwyn had, becoming fuel for a fire that demanded everything and gave nothing back except a few more centuries of borrowed light. These souls became lords of cinder, their identities consumed to keep the age of fire burning. Their reward was annihilation in service to an age that should have ended long ago. Some chose to walk away. They let the flames sputter and fade, refusing to sacrifice themselves for a world that had demanded too much for too long. These choices brought periods of darkness, times when the fire guttered low and the shadows grew bold. But the flame never quite died. Someone always came along to link it again. The cycle repeated itself over and over, each iteration weaker than the last. This was what Gwyn had created when he made his original sacrifice. Not salvation, but a pattern. Not an ending, but an endless postponement. His fear of the dark had driven him to resist the natural course of the world, and that resistance had consequences that echoed through every age that followed. The Age of Dark was supposed to come. It was the natural progression, the next chapter in a story that had been interrupted before it could reach its proper conclusion. Humanity was meant to inherit the world when the fire faded. The dark soul that lived in every human was meant to rise as the Lord's souls declined. Gwyn had prevented this. His sacrifice had been an act of desperation disguised as heroism, a choice made from fear. And every hero who linked the fire after him perpetuated that same desperate bargain. By the time the events of Dark Souls 3 unfolded, the bargain was falling apart. The kingdom of Lothric had been built around the expectation that its royal line would produce Lords of Cinder to continue the cycle. But the prince who was supposed to link the fire refused. He looked at what the ritual demanded and turned away, unwilling to sacrifice himself for an age that was already hollow. Other potential lords proved equally unwilling or unable. The system that Gwyn had established required constant sacrifice, and the supply of willing souls had finally run dry. The flame sputtered at its lowest ebb, barely a flicker where once there had been a blaze that could reshape reality. The world began to come apart. This is difficult to describe because it defied normal understanding of how reality works. Imagine places that existed in different eras suddenly occupying the same space. Imagine the ruins of kingdoms that had risen and fallen centuries apart, now sitting side by side as if they had always been neighbors. Imagine time itself losing its meaning as the power that had sustained the world's structure finally failed. The Dreg Heap was where this collapse became visible. At the edge of the world, lands and times piled together in a twisted landscape of ash and ruin. The remains of Firelink Shrine, that sacred place where so many undead had begun their journeys, now jutted from heaps of debris. Towers that resembled the architecture of Anor Londo rose from the wreckage at impossible angles. Structures that looked like they had come from Drangleic, from kingdoms the player had never visited, from places that might have existed only in alternate histories. All of them had been dredged up and deposited here. This was what happened when the First Flame's power could no longer sustain reality. The world succumbed to entropy. Everything collapsed toward the same point, drawn by forces that no longer had anything holding them back. As the Age of Fire ended, all lands met at the end of the earth. The sky above the Dreg Heap told the whole story. A dark, red-tinged expanse hung overhead, lit by a sun that had become something terrible. The pale eclipse that dominated the heavens was the dark sign itself, that cursed brand that Gwyn had burned into humanity, now reflected in the very sky. The symbol of the undead curse had become the symbol of the world's ending. This was the final stage. The Age of Fire had hollowed itself out completely. No new kingdoms would rise from these ashes without the flame to sustain them. No new heroes would emerge to restart the cycle. The choice that had been postponed so many times was finally demanding an answer that could not be delayed any longer. Pilgrims from Londor made their way to the Dreg Heap in these final days. These hollow travelers sought the dark sign of the world's end, pursuing prophecies that spoke of what would come after the fire finally failed. They believed that a new age was dawning, and they wanted to be present for its birth. The Ashen One arrived in this wasteland as well. They were not a Lord of Cinder, not a hero chosen by prophecy to continue the cycle. They were something that had been rejected by the flame, someone who had tried to link the fire and failed, now risen from the ashes of that failure to walk through a world that was ending around them. Somewhere in this collapsing landscape, the ringed city waited. It had been hidden at the edge of existence for so long that most had forgotten it existed. But now, as everything else crumbled, the city that Gwyn had built to contain the dark soul revealed itself to those who knew where to look. The enchantment that had kept it isolated was still holding, a bubble of preserved time in an ocean of entropy. The Ashen One found their way to its gates. They descended through the Dreg Heap, past the accumulated ruins of ages, past the pilgrims seeking their dark prophecies, past the remnants of everything the Age of Fire had built and failed to maintain. At the bottom of the collapse, the ringed city stood waiting. Its walls still circled the edge of the world. Its guardians still patrolled its streets. And somewhere in its heart, Filianore still slumbered, unaware that the world her father had promised to protect had finally reached its end. The stage was set for the final act of a story that had been unfolding since the first flame ignited. Whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of the ringed city, but the fate of everything that remained of a world that had been dying for far too long. Not every warrior in the Age of Fire served because they wanted to. Some served because they had no choice. The slave knights were born from desperation and cruelty. When lords needed soldiers for battles too dangerous to waste valuable troops on, they turned to the undead. These cursed humans could not permanently die. Strike them down and they would rise again, ready to fight once more. Send them into hopeless situations, and even if every single one fell, they would eventually return to try again. This made them perfect for the worst assignments, battles that no sane commander would send living soldiers into, sieges that required bodies to fill the breach regardless of casualties, conflicts where victory meant nothing if you did not survive to enjoy it. The lords called them slave knights and treated them accordingly. They received modest equipment, functional weapons and armor, well crafted but nothing special. The most distinctive part of their uniform was a red hood or cape that marked them as belonging to this particular class of disposable warrior. That crimson fabric became their identity, the only thing that set them apart from the anonymous masses of undead who shuffled through the world without purpose. Over time, something strange happened. The red hood that was supposed to mark their status as expendable became a badge of pride instead. Slave knights who survived battle after battle began to see their designation as a form of honor. They had endured what would have broken anyone else. They had faced the worst the world could throw at them and kept fighting. Their bodies showed the cost of this service. Constant combat left them charred and twisted, their flesh blackened by flame and violence accumulated over centuries. The curse that kept them alive also kept them fighting long past the point where any normal person would have collapsed. Many eventually lost their sanity, becoming little more than automatons that attacked on instinct without understanding why. Yet they were never relieved from duty. No retirement awaited a slave knight, no pension or peaceful end. They fought until they fell and rose to fight again, eternally bound to a cause that had been chosen for them by masters who saw them as tools, not people. Most slave knights eventually faded into obscurity. Their names were never recorded. Their deeds were never celebrated. They existed only to serve and suffer and continue serving. One of them refused to disappear. Gael had been a slave knight since the early days of the Age of Fire. The exact details of his origin were lost to time, but the evidence of his service was written across his body. Scars layered upon scars. Armor that had been repaired so many times, it was more patched than original material. A frame that had been broken and healed and broken again more times than anyone could count. By the time the Age of Fire reached its twilight, Gael was one of the last true slave knights still walking the world. His masters were long gone. The lords who had sent him into hopeless battles had died or faded away ages ago. The causes he had fought for had been forgotten by everyone except him. He wandered. That was what the legends called him, the red-hooded, wandering slave knight, a relic of an era that no longer existed, carrying forward knowledge and burdens that belonged to a world that had moved on without him. But Gael had not lost his purpose. Unlike so many undead who eventually succumbed to the hollowing that claimed all who bore the dark sign, Gael retained his will and his wits. Something kept him focused through the centuries of combat and loss. Something gave him a reason to keep going when everything else had fallen apart. That something was a girl he found in the painted world of Ariandel. The painted world was a realm inside a painting, a refuge created long ago for creatures who had no place in the outside world. By the time Gael discovered it, the painted world had rotted from within, its inhabitants trapped in a cycle of decay that mirrored the larger world's slow collapse. Among those inhabitants was a young painter. She was descended from Priscilla, the crossbreed who had once ruled this painted realm. Like her ancestor, she possessed the ability to create new worlds through art. She dreamed of painting a new realm, a fresh canvas that could serve as a home for those who had nowhere else to go. But she needed something to paint with. Not ordinary pigment. She needed the dark soul itself. The dark soul of man was the foundation of humanity. It was the power that the furtive pygmy had claimed from the first flame and divided among his descendants. Its blood ran in the veins of every human who had ever lived. But the concentrated essence of that soul existed only in one place. The ringed city. The pygmy lords. Gael understood what the painter needed before she fully explained it. He had lived long enough to know the legends. He knew that the dark soul had been contained at the edge of the world, guarded by knights and dragons and sleeping princesses. He knew that reaching it would mean traveling through the apocalypse unfolding across the land. He went anyway. This was not a mission assigned by any master. No lord commanded Gael to seek the dark soul. For the first time in his entire existence, the slave knight chose his own purpose. He would retrieve the blood of the dark soul and bring it back to the painter so she could create a new world from the ashes of the old one. A world that would be cold, dark, and gentle. Those were the words the painter used to describe her vision. Not a world of fire and light that demanded constant sacrifice to maintain. Not a world ruled by gods who feared what humans might become. Something entirely new, born from the very essence that had made humanity what it was. Gael knew he was not the right person for this mission. He was not a champion chosen by prophecy. He was not an ashen one destined to decide the fate of the flame. He was a simple, steadfast warrior whose only qualification was that he had survived longer than almost anyone else. But that was exactly why he could do this. Champions had responsibilities. Prophecy came with expectations. Gael had none of that. He had no fate to fulfill except the one he chose for himself. His masters were gone. His causes were forgotten. The only thing that remained was the duty he had carried for so long. And now he could finally point that duty towards something that mattered to him personally. Loyalty drove him. Loyalty to the painter who needed his help. Loyalty to the idea that something good could still come from a world that had given him nothing but suffering. Maybe loyalty to himself, to the part of his soul that still believed a slave knight could be more than a disposable weapon. Hope drove him too. Hope that the new world the painter envisioned would be better than the one that was ending. Hope that his final mission would mean something beyond just another battle in an endless war. And perhaps a touch of madness. No sane person would attempt what Gael was attempting. The dark soul was guarded by powers that had held for ages. The journey to reach it led through the collapsing remnants of reality itself. Even if Gael succeeded in obtaining what he sought, there was no guarantee he would survive to deliver it. None of that mattered to him. Gael had spent his entire existence following orders given by others. Now, at the end of everything, he had found a purpose worth choosing for himself. The red-hooded slave knight set out toward the ringed city, carrying with him the hopes of a painter and the weight of a mission that would determine whether anything survived the death of the Age of Fire. Gael left everything behind. The painter waited in her attic sanctuary, brush in hand, canvas prepared. Sister Frida had been defeated, the rot of Ariandel exposed for what it truly was. Everything was ready for the new world to be created. everything except the pigment that would give it life. So Gael walked away from the painted world and into the dying one outside. He carried a scrap with him, a torn piece of canvas stained with traces of what he sought. The blood of the dark soul had touched this fragment at some point in the distant past, leaving behind residue that served as both compass and reminder. Every time Gael looked at that scrap, he remembered why he was doing this. Every time he felt the weight of the journey pressing down on him, that fragment of painted cloth kept him moving forward. The legends all pointed to the same place. The pygmies who had taken the dark soul from the first flame still existed at the edge of the world. Their city, ringed by walls and sealed by ancient magic, held what the painter needed. Gael simply had to find it. Finding it meant crossing through hell. The path to the ringed city led through the accumulated wreckage of every kingdom that had ever fallen. Gael picked his way through ruins that had no business existing in the same space. A tower from one era leaned against the foundations of a shrine from another. Staircases led nowhere. Doorways opened onto empty sky. The landscape made no sense because it was not a landscape anymore. It was a graveyard where entire civilizations had been dumped together without regard for logic or time. Gael left marks of his passage as he traveled, scratched messages on stone surfaces, the remains of camps where he had rested between stretches of fighting. These breadcrumbs served no practical purpose for him. He was not planning to retrace his steps, but some instinct drove him to leave a trail anyway, as if part of him knew that someone would follow and might need the guidance. The deeper he traveled, the worse things became. The collapsed lands were not empty. Creatures lurked in the twisted architecture, things that had survived the end of their own eras, only to find themselves stranded in this final resting place. Hollows shuffled through the wreckage. Angels of strange design attacked from the sky, summoned by the pilgrims who had crawled here seeking the dark promise of the world's end. And then there were the demons. The chaos flame that had consumed Izalith so long ago had left survivors scattered across the ages. These demons had endured through the cycles of linking and fading, their numbers dwindling but never quite disappearing. By the time the world began its final collapse, only a handful remained, and they had gathered in the depths of this accumulated ruin, drawn by forces they probably did not understand. The Demon Prince was the last true spawn of the original chaos, twin demons that could merge into something greater, a final prince of a dying race. They made their lair in a pit at the bottom of the collapsed lands, guarding the path forward. Gael fought through or around them. The exact details remain unclear. Perhaps he faced the demons directly, his centuries of combat experience carrying him through. Perhaps he found a way to slip past while they were focused on other prey. What matters is that demon fire did not stop him. Gael moved past them the same way he had moved past every other obstacle in his existence. The path beyond the demons led upward. Gael climbed through the final stretches of collapsed reality until he reached something unexpected, a cliff edge that looked out over open sky. And in that sky, a view that confirmed everything the legends had promised. The ringed city floated at the edge of existence, preserved while everything else crumbled. Its walls still stood, its streets still held the twilight glow of Filianor's enchantment. From this vantage point, Gael could see his destination clearly for the first time. The city that had been hidden from the world since the dawn of the Age of Fire was right there, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to make the final crossing. Getting there required one more step. An old mechanism stood at the cliff's edge, designed by the gods in an age when such things still mattered. The small envoy banner was its key. When raised, the banner summoned the envoys of Gwyn himself, angelic constructs that served as ferries between the outer world and the Forbidden City. Gael had done his research. He knew about the banner and what it could do. He raised it and watched as winged figures descended from the distant city, their forms strange and not quite natural. They grasped him with limbs that should not have been able to support weight and carried him across the impossible gap toward the ringed city's entrance. The irony was thick enough to taste. These envoys had been created to serve the gods. The banner that summoned them was meant for divine messengers carrying important business to the pygmy lords. Now, a slave knight was using that same system to infiltrate the very city Gwyn had built to contain humanity's potential. The Forbidden Land welcomed Gael as if he were an honored guest, its ancient magic unable to distinguish between those who served the gods and those who simply knew how to use their tools. Gael entered the ringed city ahead of everyone else. He had a head start that might have seemed insurmountable, but he was not the only one who had learned of this place and decided to seek it out. The Ashen One received word through a portal in the painted world. Gael had left a message explaining what he intended to do and asking for help. The painting that served as a doorway between worlds now offered passage to the collapsing lands where Gael had traveled. The same path, the same perils, the same destination at the end. The Ashen One followed the trail Gael had left. They found his messages scratched into stone. They discovered the remains of his camps. They faced the same angels and hollows that Gael had navigated before them. The demon prince awaited the Ashen One as well. The final spawn of chaos still guarded the path forward. The Ashen One fought them properly, a battle against twin demons that merged into a prince of fire and rage. Victory opened the way to the same cliffs Gael had reached. The small envoy banner remained where Gael had left it. He had no need to carry it with him once he reached the city. The Ashen One picked it up and raised it just as Gael had, summoning the same angelic envoys to carry them across the gap. The system that had served Gael now served his pursuer, ancient magic operating without any awareness of the stories unfolding around it. By the time the Ashen One arrived at the ringed city's entrance, Gael was already deep inside. He had passed through the streets, fought or avoided the guardians, and pushed toward whatever lay at the city's heart. The Ashen One would have to catch up, navigating the same defenses Gael had overcome, while simultaneously pursuing their own reasons for being here. Two unkindled undead had converged on the same forbidden place. One sought the blood of the dark soul to serve a painter's vision. The other sought answers, or perhaps simply followed the only path that remained in a world where all other paths had collapsed into ash. They did not know they were running parallel journeys toward the same destination. They did not realize that their stories would intersect at the very end of everything. The ringed city awaited them both. Its secrets had been buried for ages beyond counting. Its guardians still stood ready to defend what Gwyn had hidden here. And somewhere in its depths, the pygmy lords still held the dark soul that had been theirs since the beginning of the Age of Fire. Gael was already searching for them. The Ashen One was catching up. The final act was about to begin. The first thing that struck visitors was the light. After traveling through ash deserts and collapsed ruins where the sky burned red with the dying sun, the ringed city felt like stepping into a memory. A faintly golden glow hung over everything, the kind of light that belonged to a sunset that never quite finished setting. The air was cleaner here, plants still grew. Stone walls that should have crumbled ages ago stood firm and proud, their surfaces weathered but unbroken. This was what Filianor's enchantment had preserved. A pocket of the Age of Fire frozen at its twilight moment, protected from the entropy that had consumed everything else. The Ashen One descended into this preserved world and found themselves in a place that defied the reality they had just left behind. Colossal walls ringed the city on all sides, their height blocking any view of what lay beyond. Within those walls, the architecture rose in layers and levels, a maze of winding staircases and grand halls that seemed designed to confuse as much as impress. The beauty was unmistakable. Ornate statues lined the main thoroughfares, their poses suggesting reverence and supplication. Gardens filled the spaces between buildings, overgrown but still alive with greenery that had no business existing at the end of the world. The craftsmanship, evident in every archway and pillar, spoke of a civilization that had poured its soul into creating something magnificent. But the decay was there too, hiding beneath the surface. Cracks ran through walls that looked solid from a distance. Sections of floor had collapsed into the levels below. Some buildings had clearly been damaged in conflicts long past, their facades scarred by weapons and fire. The city was ancient, and even magic could not completely halt the erosion of ages. One mural in particular caught the eye of anyone who passed it. The image depicted Gwyn himself, recognizable by his crown and bearing, standing over a group of kneeling figures. These were the Pygmy Lords, shown in the act of submission or gratitude. The scene was meant to commemorate the pact that had created this city, the moment when Gwyn had gifted this place to the humans who carried the dark soul. The truth behind that image was more complicated than the mural suggested. But to the Pygmies who had lived here for ages, this depiction had been their history, their reminder of why they existed in isolation at the edge of the world. The lower levels of the city told a different story than the grand facades above. Down in the depths, where the streets descended into swampy pools and narrow passages, dark residues swirled through the water. This was abyssal murk, the physical manifestation of the dark soul's influence seeping out from whatever containers had tried to hold it. The presence of this darkness suggested that pockets of the abyss had formed over time, either from experiments the Pygmies conducted or simply from the nature of the power they carried. The enchantment had kept this corruption from overwhelming the city, but it had not eliminated it entirely. The abyss was patient. It seeped and spread slowly, finding cracks in whatever defenses tried to contain it. Given enough time, it would have consumed even this preserved haven. But time had been suspended here, and so the darkness remained in its pockets, waiting. Strange creatures inhabited these lower regions. Merkmen emerged from the dark water, beings that seemed to be animated by the accumulated detritus of the dreg heap itself. They were more animated refuse than living things, leftovers from the collision of ages given just enough form to move and attack. Fighting them felt less like combat and more like wading through the physical manifestation of entropy. The locust preachers were stranger still. These insectoid figures spoke in riddles and warnings, their words often more disturbing than their appearance. One such preacher offered advice that seemed like nonsense at first hearing, but carried weight for anyone who understood what lay at the city's heart. The preacher compared Filianor's resting place to something that should remain covered. The implication was crude but clear. Some things were meant to stay sealed because opening them would release what had been contained. The preacher did not explain what would happen if someone disturbed the princess. It simply warned that the disturbance would be unpleasant for everyone involved. This warning might have come from the Pygmy Lords themselves, delivered through creatures they had created or influenced. Even at the end of everything, some part of the city's original inhabitants still tried to protect what they had been charged with guarding. The warning went unheeded. The Ashen One pressed deeper into the city regardless of cryptic advice from giant insects. The guardians who patrolled the streets were far more direct in their opposition. Ringed knights still wandered the paths and plazas of their ancestral home, their armor blackened and their weapons wreathed in flames that never died. These were the same warriors who had fought alongside Gwyn against the dragons in an age so distant that most had forgotten it ever happened. They had been confined here afterward, branded and contained, along with the dark soul they carried. And they had continued their vigil ever since, defending the city against any who would threaten it. They attacked the Ashen One on sight. There was no parley, no attempt at communication. The ringed knights recognized an intruder and responded the only way they knew how, Their greatswords carved arcs of fire through the air, their spears thrust with enough force to ignite the atmosphere around them. Each knight was a formidable opponent, skilled from countless years of combat and empowered by the dark fire that burned within them. The Ashen One fought through them one by one. Each fallen knight represented a piece of history crumbling. These were humans who had served the gods faithfully, who had been rewarded for that service with imprisonment and erasure from the records. They had guarded this city for longer than most civilizations existed, and now they were being cut down by another human who had come seeking what they protected. There was symbolism in these battles that neither side probably recognized. Every ringed knight who fell was another barrier Gwyn had erected against humanity being torn down. The system of control that had kept the dark soul contained for ages was failing, one guardian at a time. The Ashen One was not consciously trying to dismantle that system. They were only trying to progress deeper into the city. But the effect was the same, regardless of intent. The streets grew quieter as the Ashen One advanced. Fewer knights patrolled the intersections, either because their numbers had dwindled over the ages, or because the defenses concentrated elsewhere. The architecture changed as well, becoming more personal and less monumental. These were the quarters where the pygmy lords had actually lived, the homes and gardens they had maintained during their long isolation. Signs of recent disturbance appeared along the way. A door forced open that should have been sealed. Bodies of guardians who had fallen to someone else's blade before the Ashen One arrived. Gael had come this way already, his passage leaving marks that anyone following could read. The slave knight had cut his own path through the city's defenses, clearing the way for whoever came after him. The Ashen One followed that cleared path, stepping over fallen knights and through broken barricades. Gael sought the pygmy lords and their dark soul blood. The Ashen One sought whatever answers or purpose the ringed city might provide. Both paths led to the same place. Ahead, the great dome of Filianor's church rose above the surrounding buildings, the center of the city, the heart of everything hidden here since the beginning of the Age of Fire. The Ashen One approached that dome with the weight of the entire journey pressing down on them. The final barriers stood between them and the truth, and those barriers were about to fall. Not everyone the Ashen One met in the ringed city wanted them dead. Among the ruins and patrolling knights, there were pockets of something almost resembling normalcy. Other undead had made their way to this place, drawn by the same forces that had pulled the Ashen One here. Some of them had stories of their own, side journeys that ran parallel to the main path without ever quite intersecting with its purpose. One such wanderer called himself Lap. The Ashen One encountered this amnesiac adventurer in the less traveled corners of the city. Lap had lost his memories somewhere along the way, his past stripped from him by the same curse that had taken so much from so many undead over the ages. He seemed genuinely confused about who he was or why he had come to the ringed city. All he knew was that he was searching for something, a treasure hidden somewhere in this forgotten place. What Lap sought was the Purging Monument, a relic tucked away in one of the city's most decrepit sections. This monument had the power to restore what had been lost, to purge corruption from those who approached it seeking absolution. Its existence in a city designed to contain the dark soul was almost ironic. Even here, at the heart of everything Gwyn had tried to suppress, there were means to cleanse and restore. The pygmies who built their civilization in this isolated haven had created tools for dealing with the very darkness they carried. The Purging Monument lay hidden in a poisonous swamp, one of those lower sections where the abyssal murk had pooled and the architecture had crumbled. Finding it required navigating hazards that seemed designed to discourage casual exploration. But Lap was determined. and the Ashen One could help him reach his goal if they chose to. What happened when Lap finally recovered his memories revealed the truth. The friendly amnesiac was actually Unbreakable Patches, a notorious trickster and thief who had caused problems for undead travelers across multiple ages. His amnesia had been genuine, but so was the personality that emerged once he remembered who he was. This encounter added a human element to a city filled with ancient guardians and cosmic stakes. Even here, at the literal end of everything, regular undead with their own agendas still roamed the ruins. But Lap was a distraction from the main path. The Ashen One had more pressing concerns. Shira waited in one of the buildings near that church. Speaking through a closed door, this knight identified herself as Shira, Knight of Filianor. Her voice carried the weight of duty maintained for longer than most civilizations had existed. She demanded to know whether the visitor was a friend or foe of the gods, a question that seemed almost quaint given how thoroughly the gods' age had ended. But Shira still cared about such distinctions. She still measured the world by the standards Gwyn had established when he first built this city. If the Ashen One responded peacefully, Shira proved willing to share information. She spoke of the city's history and its purpose. She explained her own role as one of Filianor's guardians, a position she had held for so long that the outside world had become an abstraction. Most importantly, she made a request that revealed how much she still cared about the beings who had protected this place. Shira asked the Ashen One to end Dark Eater Midir's suffering. This confirmed what anyone who had ventured deep into the city already suspected. Midir's corruption had progressed to the point where even his allies recognized that he needed to be put down. Shira could not do it herself. She had tried, and the battle had cost Midir an eye, but the dragon was too powerful for her to defeat alone. So she sought help from the only person who seemed capable of finishing what she had started. The request was an admission of failure, wrapped in an act of mercy. Shira still believed in her duty, still served the princess she had sworn to protect. But she recognized that some parts of the old order needed to end. Midir had served faithfully for ages beyond counting. The kindest thing anyone could do was free him from the corruption consuming his mind. Shira's presence proved that not everyone in the ringed city was an enemy. Some guardians still followed Gwyn's will, still maintained their posts. They would not actively help the Ashen One reach Filianor, but neither would they stand in the way as long as certain conditions were met. The path beyond Shira's building led toward the inner walls. The architecture grew more imposing, towers and battlements designed to impress visitors. Somewhere ahead, Judicator Argo's voice could be heard echoing through stone corridors, warning intruders of what awaited. But before reaching the church itself, one final obstacle blocked the way. A bridge connected the outer sections of the city to the plaza in front of Filianor's church. This bridge was the only direct route to the princess's resting place, and it was guarded by the most fearsome defender the ringed city had to offer. Midir appeared as the Ashen One attempted to cross. The dragon descended from the heights in a rush of wings and fury, landing on the bridge with enough force to shake the stone beneath. He breathed dark flame across the narrow passage, a mixture of fire and abyssal energy that burned with colors no natural fire possessed. The confrontation was unavoidable. Midir had stationed himself here specifically to prevent anyone from reaching the church beyond. The battle that followed was desperate and chaotic. The bridge offered little room to maneuver, and Midir's attacks could clear the entire width in a single sweep. The Ashen One fought to survive while looking for any opportunity to drive the dragon back. Eventually, through persistence and skill, they managed to wound Midir enough to send him plunging off the bridge into the chasm below. But the fall did not kill an immortal dragon. Midir survived, waiting in the depths for anyone brave or foolish enough to seek him out. The bridge was clear, but the Guardian remained. Only by venturing into Medea's chasm and defeating him properly could the threat be eliminated entirely. Shira had offered to help with this task, and her aid could make the difference between victory and another frustrating attempt at an opponent who seemed designed to punish hesitation. Whether the Ashen One chose to pursue Medea immediately or press forward, the dragon's fall marked a turning point. The greatest external defender of the ringed city had been driven back. The path to Philionor was open for the first time in ages. The bridge crossing felt different without Medea looming overhead. The environment grew quiet and solemn. Ahead, the church doors waited, massive but no longer guarded by anything that could physically stop someone from entering. A fog door manifested at the entrance. Stepping through it meant committing to whatever waited on the other side. Inside the church, the scale of the architecture became overwhelming. Vaulted ceilings stretched into darkness. At the far end, a massive statue dominated the scene. It depicted a reclining figure large enough to be a god, with a smaller carving of a young girl at its feet. This was almost certainly Gwyn and Philionor, the father who had sent his daughter here and promised to return. That promise had never been kept. But the statue remained, a monument to an oath that had died with the god who made it. Judicator Argo stood before this statue, a giant minister whose purpose was to test anyone who sought passage to the princess beyond. When the Ashen One entered, Argo's voice boomed through the church, invoking something called the King's Decree. This was an ancient commandment that no one should disturb Philionor's sleep. The decree had stood for ages, enforced by guardians who took their duty seriously enough to die for it. Argo's method of enforcement was to summon a champion. The spears of the church covenant had been created specifically to provide defenders for moments like this. Anyone who had sworn themselves to Philionor's protection could be called upon to face intruders in her name. The champion who answered the summons was Halflight, the last recorded spear of the church. He had dedicated his existence to this moment, waiting for the day when someone would finally break through all other defenses and reach the princess's inner sanctum. Now that day had arrived, and Halflight stood ready to fulfill the purpose that had sustained him through ages of patient vigilance. The battle unfolded beneath a towering stained glass image of Philionor's face. The princess watched from the window above, forever young in the artist's rendering, as her final defender fought. Light blades materialized from the ground, the miraculous power granted to spears of the church. Ghostly paintings, guardians joined the fight, healing Halflight and harassing the Ashen One from multiple angles. But the Ashen One had faced too much to be stopped here. They had traveled through collapsed ages, fought demons and dragons and endless flaming nights. One more defender could not turn them back. Halflight fell. The last spear of the church collapsed, his centuries of preparation ending in defeat. The covenant was broken. Judicator Argo watched his champion fall and slumped in visible despair. The giant minister had no more defenders to summon. For the first time in the history of the ringed city, the path to Philionor's resting place lay completely unguarded. No knights patrolled the steps beyond. No dragons circled overhead. No spectral champions waited. The defenses Gwyn had established when he built this city had all been torn down. The Ashen One climbed the steps alone toward the chamber where Philionor waited. At the top, a final door opened onto a pristine room. The contrast with the rest of the city was stark. Where everything else showed signs of age, this room remained perfect and untouched. Soft light filtered through windows facing a sky that might not have been real. And there, on a bed at the room's center, Philionor slept. The princess who had been sent here ages ago to seal the pact between gods and pygmies lay in eternal repose, undisturbed by the passage of time or the battles that had raged to reach her. Her face was peaceful, her posture relaxed, her hands cradling something against her chest. The Ashen One had reached the heart of the ringed city. Whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of this hidden place, but possibly the fate of whatever remained of the world beyond its walls. The choice to wake the princess waited ahead, and everything was about to change. She looked so peaceful. Filianore lay upon a bed that seemed unbefitting of a princess. Her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. White robes draped her slender form, pristine despite the ages that had passed since she first closed her eyes. Her face held no tension, no worry, none of the weight that had pressed down on everyone else who had lived through the dying of the Age of Fire. She slept as if the world beyond her chamber did not exist, as if nothing had ever gone wrong. In her arms, cradled against her chest like something precious, rested a cracked shell. The object resembled an egg, though what creature could have laid such a thing defied imagination. Fractures ran across its surface, lines of damage that suggested fragility barely held together. Whatever power this shell once contained, it was clearly failing. The cracks were not new. They had been spreading for a very long time. The room around Filianore held its breath. Soft light filtered through windows that faced a sky the Ashen One could not quite see clearly. The silence was absolute, the kind that settles into places where nothing has moved for centuries. Dust should have covered everything. Decay should have set in. But the chamber remained as perfect as the day Filianore first lay down to sleep, preserved by the same magic that kept the entire city frozen in twilight. For ages beyond counting, no living being had dared to enter this space. The guardians who protected the ringed city understood that Filianore's sleep was sacred, that disturbing her meant breaking something fundamental about how the world worked. The pact that Gwyn had made with the Pygmy Lords depended on this princess remaining undisturbed. Touch her, and the promise that held everything together would shatter. The Ashen One stood at the edge of the bed, looking down at a goddess who had been sent here by her father, and then forgotten. What thoughts crossed their mind in that moment? Curiosity about what would happen if the shell were touched. Desperation to find whatever answers this place might hold. Hope that waking the princess could somehow change something about the dying world outside. Or perhaps nothing so complex. Perhaps the Ashen One saw a prompt, a choice presented like so many choices before, and reached out because that was what the journey demanded. Touch the embraced shell. The Ashen One extended their hand and made contact with the cracked surface. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The shell felt cool and dry, its texture like old eggshell left in the sun too long. Then the fractures began to spread. New cracks appeared, racing across the surface faster than the eye could follow. The shell that had held together for ages was finally giving way, its structural integrity failing in the span of seconds. Filianore's eyes opened. The princess who had slept since the dawn of the Age of Fire returned to consciousness for the first and last time. Her eyes were unfocused, staring at something the Ashen One could not see. There was no recognition in that gaze, no awareness of the stranger standing beside her bed. Filianore looked blind, or perhaps she was seeing something that existed only in her fading dream. The shell crumbled to dust in her hands. Whatever had been contained within it, whatever power had sustained the enchantment that kept the ringed city frozen in time, evaporated like morning mist. The fragments fell through Filianore's fingers and scattered across the bed, losing cohesion until nothing remained but grey powder that could have been ash. Then Filianore herself began to change. The youthful face that had remained untouched by time started to wither. Skin that had been smooth and pale grew thin and papery, drawing tight against the bones beneath. Her dark hair turned white and brittle, strands breaking away at the slightest movement of air. The body that had appeared so healthy moments ago shriveled into something desiccated and corpse-like. Decades or centuries of aging compressed into mere seconds. The Ashen One watched a goddess die of old age in the time it took to draw a breath. Filianor's last act was a sound, a moan, or perhaps a sigh, the noise of someone waking from a dream, only to discover that the dream was all that had been keeping them alive. There was no word of greeting for her visitor, no final message to deliver, just that single expression of distress before whatever remained of her life finally gave out. Her duty, maintained for longer than most worlds existed, had ended the moment someone broke the taboo and touched what should have remained untouched. Light exploded outward from where Filianor lay. The Ashen One had no time to react. The brilliance was blinding, overwhelming, a flash that seemed to pierce through closed eyelids and burn directly into the mind. Consciousness fled. The world went white and then black and then simply ceased to exist for a period that could have been seconds or centuries. When awareness returned, everything had changed. The Ashen One found themselves no longer in Filianor's chamber. The bed was gone. The walls were gone. The soft light and the perfect preservation and the silence that had felt almost sacred were all gone. In their place stretched a landscape that bore no resemblance to the city that had existed moments before. Ash dunes rolled toward every horizon. The sky above was black and red, lit by a sun that had become something terrible. Where the golden twilight of the enchanted city had hung, now burned a dark eclipse. The sun itself had transformed into the dark sign, that cursed brand that Gwyn had burned into humanity, now reflected in the heavens as if the entire world had succumbed to the same curse that plagued the undead. The grand architecture of the ringed city was gone. Where towers and halls and gardens had stood, only sparse ruins remained. Fragments of buildings jutted from the ash like broken bones, half buried and weathered to the point of being unrecognizable. The walls that had ringed this place for ages had crumbled into scattered rubble. The streets that knights had patrolled since the war against the dragons had been swallowed by the desert that consumed everything else. The Ashen One stood in what had once been a vibrant metropolis and saw only death. This was what Filianor's enchantment had been holding back. Not just the passage of time, but the full weight of the world's ending. The Age of Fire had been dying for so long that its final moments should have arrived ages ago. The ringed city had been preserved in a bubble of frozen time, protected from the entropy that had claimed everything else. When Filianor woke, that bubble popped. Thousands of years of accumulated decay crashed down on the city in an instant. The Locust Preacher's warning echoed in memory. Filianor's resting place was like something that should remain covered. Opening it would unleash what had been contained. The warning had been literal. The moment the princess woke, everything that had been held back by her sleep came rushing in. The forbidden lore of the ringed city was now fully revealed. Everything that Gwyn had tried to hide when he built this place at the edge of the world was laid bare under the red sky. The gods' works were transient. The promises they made meant nothing in the face of time. The Age of Fire that Gwyn had sacrificed himself to preserve had been dying all along, kept alive only through artificial means and desperate measures. Now even those measures had failed. Gwyn had promised Filianor that he would return for her. He had sent his youngest daughter to this isolated city as part of a pact with the Pygmies, assuring her that the separation would not be permanent. That promise had been broken ages ago, when Gwyn threw himself into the first flame and became fuel for a fire that could not be maintained. He never came back. He was never going to come back. And now there was nothing left of Filianor, or the city he had given her to prove that any of it had ever meant anything at all. The Ashen One walked through the ash desert that had been the ringed city. Somewhere in this wasteland, the pygmy lords who had carried the dark soul since the dawn of the age still existed, or what remained of them. The blood that Gael sought for his painter's canvas was here, waiting to be claimed by someone strong enough to take it. The end of the enchantment had not eliminated the dark soul. It had simply stripped away the protections that had kept it contained. The world beyond the ringed city had collapsed into the dreg heap. The world within had now joined it, reduced to the same ash and ruin that marked everything else. There were no more hidden havens where the age of fire still flickered. There were no more preserved pockets of the old world waiting to be discovered. The fire had gone out everywhere, and what remained was the darkness that had always been waiting to inherit the world. Filianor's tower still stood in the distance, the only structure that had survived the transition relatively intact. It marked the spot where the princess had slept and where she had finally been released from her endless vigil. A landmark in a desert of nothing, pointing toward the sky like a finger accusing the gods who had abandoned this place and everyone in it. The Ashen One had come to the ringed city seeking something. Answers, perhaps. A way to change the fate of a dying world. Instead, they had found the truth hidden since the beginning. The Age of Fire was ending. Nothing could stop it. All the sacrifices and desperate measures had only delayed an inevitable conclusion. But there was still one more act to play out. Somewhere in this ash desert, Gael was hunting the pygmy lords. The slave knight who had traveled to the end of the world to retrieve the blood of the dark soul was still pursuing his mission, unaware or uncaring that the city he had infiltrated had crumbled around him. His purpose remained unchanged. The painter still waited for her pigment. A new world could still be created from the ashes of the old one. The Ashen One moved forward through the dunes, following the only path that remained. The truth had been uncovered. The enchantment had been broken. Filianor's dream had ended, and with it any pretense that the Age of Fire could be preserved. What came next would be determined by whoever survived this final stretch of dying world. The Ashen One, Gael, the shattered remnants of the pygmy lords. One of them would claim the dark soul, and that claim would decide what form the future took. The red sky burned overhead. The ash dunes stretched in every direction. And somewhere ahead, the last battle of the Age of Fire was waiting to begin. The bodies were everywhere. Scattered across the ash dunes like discarded dolls, the pygmy lords lay where they had fallen. Their forms had shriveled into hollowed husks, skin drawn tight over bones that no longer held any vitality. These were the beings who had carried fragments of the dark soul since the dawn of the Age of Fire, the descendants of the furtive pygmy who had claimed that primordial power from the first flame itself. They had survived longer than almost any other beings in existence, enduring through ages that saw entire civilizations rise and crumble to nothing. Now they were dead, all of them. The Ashen One walked among the remains, each step kicking up ash that might have once been streets or gardens, or the foundations of grand buildings. The pygmy lords had not died peacefully. Their bodies showed signs of violence, of struggle, of a final desperate attempt to defend themselves against something that had overwhelmed them completely. One figure still moved. A pygmy king clung to the last moments of his existence. His body was as withered as the others, his form barely recognizable as something that had once held power and authority. But his lips still moved, forming words that the Ashen One could just barely hear. The prayer was heartbreaking in its futility. Filianor was gone. The princess who had been sent here to protect the pygmies, whose enchanted sleep had preserved their city against the ravages of time, had died the moment her shell crumbled. This pygmy king was praying to someone who could no longer answer, begging for salvation from a goddess who had withered to dust in her own chamber. The pygmy lords had endured until this final moment. When Filianor's protection fell and time came rushing in, they had been exposed to the full weight of the world's ending. Their blood, once thick with the power of the dark soul, had dried over the eons that suddenly caught up to them. They had literally run out of time, their ancient bodies finally succumbing to an age that should have claimed them centuries ago. But something else had happened here too, something that explained why the bodies showed signs of violence. Near the fallen pygmies, the Ashen One noticed dark stains on the ash, bloodstains that had dried to a thick residue, marks of struggle that spoke of a battle fought recently, at least relative to the timeless quality of this wasteland. Someone had come here and attacked the pygmy lords while they were still alive enough to fight back. The truth became clear as the Ashen One pieced together what they were seeing. Gael had found the pygmy lords first. The slave knight had travelled to the ringed city, seeking the blood of the dark soul for his painter's canvas. He had navigated the Dreg Heap, infiltrated the Forbidden City, and somehow reached this place ahead of anyone else. When Filianor's enchantment broke and the city crumbled into ash, Gael was already here, ready to claim what he had come for. But the pygmy's blood had long ago dried. Ages of stasis under Filianor's spell had preserved the pygmy lords in a state of living death, their bodies sustained but their vitality slowly ebbing away. When Gael approached them, seeking the blood that would serve as pigment for a new world, he discovered that what remained in their veins was not liquid, but a thick, dark essence. The concentrated remnants of the dark soul had become something closer to dust than blood, impossible to extract through any normal means. So Gael did something terrible. He consumed them. The slave knight, who had set out on a noble mission to save humanity's future, became a cannibal and a blood thief. He attacked the pygmy lords and devoured their desiccated forms, taking into himself the dark soul that their bodies contained. Every fragment of that primordial power that had been divided among the pygmies for ages, beyond counting, now resided within a single being. This was confirmed by what the Ashen One would later learn. When Gael came upon the pygmy lords, he discovered their blood had long ago dried, and so he consumed the dark soul. Gael had eaten the pygmy lords to obtain the pigment he needed. He had destroyed the last descendants of the furtive pygmy, not out of malice, but out of desperate necessity. The Gael who remained after this feast was no longer just a tired slave knight on a final mission. He had ingested the literal soul of humanity, the concentrated essence of the dark that lived in every human being. That kind of power could not be absorbed without consequence. It would change him, warp him, transform him into something that might still remember its original purpose, but could no longer pursue it through rational means. The hunger would be terrible. The dark soul was not meant to be contained within a single vessel. It had been divided among countless humans precisely because its power was too great for one being to hold. Now Gael carried all of it, and that burden would drive him to madness even as it granted him strength beyond anything he had possessed before. The pygmy lords were gone, every one of them. The bloodline that had begun with the furtive pygmy, claiming a lord's soul from the first flame, ended here, in this ash desert at the end of everything. These beings had obeyed Gwyn's commands for ages beyond counting. They had accepted their isolation in the ringed city without rebellion. They had maintained their end of the pact, even as the gods abandoned them and the world outside crumbled. And in the end, they had been destroyed not by the gods they served, or the demons that plagued other lands, but by a fellow human driven by duty to use their dark soul for a new purpose. The irony was almost too cruel to contemplate. The pygmies had never usurped the fire. They had never challenged the age of fire or tried to claim the world for humanity as Kath and others had urged. They had been the perfect subjects, content in their gilded cage at the edge of existence. Their reward for all that patience and loyalty was to be hunted down and consumed by someone who did not even hate them, who simply needed what they carried and could think of no other way to obtain it. From Gael's perspective, the painter needed pigment, and the pygmies had it. Their dark soul would give life to a new world, one that might shelter whatever remained of humanity after the Age of Fire finally died. The ends justified the means, because there were no other means available. From the pygmies' perspective, this was the ultimate betrayal. They had guarded the dark soul for ages, trusting that it would remain their legacy, their connection to the power that made humanity unique. Now that legacy had been ripped away by someone who wanted to use it for purposes they had never chosen or approved, the Ashen One walked past the last of the bodies and into the wasteland beyond. The environment here defied easy description. In the distance, a giant dark sun hung in the sky, swirling with energies that could have been the last ember of the first flame, or the triumphant darkness of the abyss, finally consuming everything. The eclipse that dominated the heavens cast no warmth, only a dim illumination that turned everything the same shade of grey and red. The ruins of the ringed city were barely visible anymore. What had been towers and walls and grand architecture was now just jagged rocks protruding from the dunes. The ash had swallowed almost everything, leaving only hints that a city had ever existed in this place. In another few centuries, even those hints would be gone. There were no signs of life anywhere, no birds in the sky, no creatures scuttling through the ash. Even the ghostly apparitions that had haunted other parts of the dying world seemed absent here. This place was too far gone even for ghosts. It was the corpse of the Age of Fire itself, the final resting place of everything that had existed since the first flame ignited and brought disparity into the world. The Ashen One had travelled to the kiln of the first flame before reaching this place. That sacred site, where Gwyn had sacrificed himself to prolong the Age of Light, had seemed like the end of everything. But the kiln was just a waypoint compared to this. Here, at the literal end of the earth, lay the true conclusion of all kingdoms and all gods. The first flame had finally faltered to nothing more than a cinder. The curse of undeath that had plagued humanity for so long might have finally consumed the world entirely. The dark sign in the sky, suggesting that the branded had inherited an existence of nothing but ash. Or perhaps the flame had simply burned out, leaving behind a world that could no longer sustain any kind of fire at all. Either way, this was the end. The absolute end. There would be no more linking of fires. No more cycles of light and dark. No more kingdoms rising and falling in the eternal dance of disparity. Whatever happened next would not be a continuation of the story that had been unfolding since the Age of Ancients. It would be something entirely new, or it would be nothing at all. Somewhere in this wasteland, Gael waited. The slave knight who had consumed the dark soul was out there, transformed by the power he had absorbed and driven by hungers he could no longer control. He had what the painter needed. He had what the Ashen One would need if there was any hope of salvaging something from the wreckage of the dying world. But Gael would not give it up willingly. The dark soul did not allow for rational thought anymore. Whatever remained of the man who had set out from the painted world on a noble mission was now buried under layers of power and madness. The Ashen One would have to take what they needed by force. The final confrontation was moments away. In this silent, forsaken battleground where the Age of Fire had breathed its last, two unkindled undead would fight for the right to determine what came next. One of them carried the dark soul of humanity. The other carried the will to claim it. Only one of them would walk away. The battle with Gael was not a quick affair. A slave knight who had survived centuries of combat did not fall easily, even when driven mad by the power consuming him from within. Gael fought with the tenacity that had carried him through countless battles across different ages. He attacked without pause and defended without hesitation. The Ashen One faced an opponent who would not stop until one of them could no longer stand. The first phase of the duel showed glimpses of the warrior Gael had once been. Beneath the frenzy and the madness, his fighting style still carried the marks of a seasoned knight. Sword combos flowed together with practiced precision. Acrobatic lunges covered distance faster than seemed possible for someone his size. His crossbow fired between melee exchanges, forcing the Ashen One to stay mobile, even when they thought they had found safe ground. This was the muscle memory of a lifetime spent in combat. Gael's conscious mind might have been lost to the dark soul, but his body remembered how to fight. Every swing of his greatsword carried the weight of experience accumulated over more years than most people could imagine. The beast wearing his flesh was still a dangerous warrior underneath all the corruption. As the battle wore on, something changed. Gael began drawing more explicitly on the power of the souls he had consumed. The second phase of his rage brought new attacks that defied natural explanation. He cracked the air above the battlefield, and red skulls materialized from nothing. These fragments of the dark soul cascaded downward like falling stars, homing in on the Ashen One with a hunger that matched their creator. Dodging one skull only brought another swooping in from a different angle. His greatsword began to crackle with dark blood lightning. The blade that had already been dangerous became something worse, each strike carrying the concentrated power of the pygmy lords he had devoured. The red and black energy that coated the weapon left burns on anything it touched. The air itself seemed to sizzle when Gael swung. The Ashen One pushed through this escalation with determination born of necessity. There was no retreat available. There was no strategic withdrawal possible. The only way out of this arena was through the monster standing in the middle of it. Then came the third phase. Gael's humanity, sprites boiled over completely. The ghostly faces in his cape screamed silently as he drew on every last fragment of power contained within his twisted form. He lifted off the ground, levitating on currents of dark energy that had no business existing in the physical world. The slave knight, who had once been bound to the earth, now floated above it like some terrible angel of the ending age. The ground itself erupted in response to his power, chunks of compacted ash exploding upward as if the battlefield was rebelling against the forces being unleashed upon it. His roars shook the arena. The sound was not merely loud, it carried weight, a physical presence that pressed against the Ashen One's chest and made breathing difficult. Gael was throwing everything he had into this final stand, the souls of the pygmy lords, the power of the dark soul, the strength accumulated over a lifetime of service and suffering. All of it poured out in a torrent of violence that seemed impossible to survive. Yet the Ashen One persisted. Through skill or luck or simple stubbornness, they weathered the storm of Gael's fury. They found openings between attacks and exploited them. They dodged the homing skulls and rolled under the beam blasts. They struck back whenever Gael left himself vulnerable, chipping away at an enemy who seemed to have limitless reserves of power. Gael's health began to drop. The accumulated damage started to show in how he moved. His attacks came slower, his defenses grew sloppier. The beast that had seemed unstoppable was finally reaching its limits. The final blow landed. Gael collapsed onto his knees in the ash. The slave knight who had traveled to the end of the world and consumed the dark soul of humanity knelt in defeat, his body finally giving out after everything it had endured. He looked like a man exhausted after a lifetime of struggle, shoulders slumped and head bowed as if the weight of ages had finally become too much to bear. Blood dripped from his body. Thick and black, the essence of the dark soul seeped from his wounds and fell to the ground around him. The same substance dripped from the sky above, as if the heavens themselves were mourning what had been lost here. The blood pooled around Gael's kneeling form, creating a dark stain on the ash that would mark this spot forever. In his final moments, Gael made sounds that were difficult to interpret. Bestial groans escaped his throat. Perhaps there was a faint sigh mixed in with the animal noises, but there were no coherent words. If any part of his rational mind returned at the end, it did not have the strength to speak. It remained ambiguous whether Gael understood what was happening in those last seconds. Perhaps somewhere deep inside, buried under layers of madness and power, the slave knight felt a sense of completion. He had obtained what he came for. The pigment existed. The only thing left was for someone else to carry it forward. Then he was gone. The Ashen One stood alone in the silence that followed. The victorious fighter approached Gael's fallen form and claimed what remained. The blood of the Dark Soul was now a physical item, a vial containing the thick black essence that had seeped from Gael's body. This small container held the concentrated power of the Pygmy Lords, and by extension, the very soul of humanity itself. Everything else was empty. The ashen wasteland stretched in every direction without end. No throne waited to be claimed. No dramatic transformation of the world announced the victory. No Dark Lord rose from the ashes to challenge the new order. There was only silence and the endless grey expanse that had once been a beautiful city at the edge of existence. This was the epilogue of the Age of Fire. Gael had been arguably the last being still actively pursuing a goal from the prior age. Everyone else who had sought the flame or the dark had either succeeded or failed long before this moment. The linking of the fire, the quest to usher in an age of dark. All of those grand ambitions had played out across centuries, and now only the aftermath remained. The Ashen One had won, but the victory felt melancholy. They had not fought for the flame or for the dark directly. They had fought for a gentle dream that existed in a painting far away. A young woman waited in an attic somewhere, brush in hand, hoping that someone would bring her the pigment she needed to create a new world. Gael's tragedy was complete. The slave knight had become the very darkness he sought, consumed by the power he tried to harvest. And in the end, he was put down by another undead who needed what he carried. The pattern of dark souls repeated itself one final time. Each era's giants were slain by their own inheritors. The Pygmy Lords were killed by Gael. Gael was killed by the Ashen One. The chain of succession continued even at the literal end of everything. The forbidden law was now fully revealed in all its bitter truth. The dark soul had never been lost. Gwyn had hidden it in the ringed city and isolated it through schemes that spanned ages. He had sealed humanity's potential behind walls and guardians, and a sleeping princess whose enchantment kept time itself at bay. Every measure he took was designed to delay what he feared most, and all of it had been futile. Filianor's sleep ended. The ringed knights fell. Midir was defeated. The spears of the church were broken. One by one, every defense Gwyn erected was torn down, and the dark soul resurfaced exactly as he feared it would. The Age of Fire ended not with a grand battle between light and dark, but with an exhausted undead standing in an ash desert, holding a vial of blood. The ringed city that had once been a beautiful haven lay in ruins. The pact that Gwyn had made with the Pygmy Lords meant nothing now. The legacy of the furtive Pygmy and all his descendants was stained with blood up to the very end. They had guarded the dark soul faithfully for longer than any other beings in existence, and their reward was to be devoured by a man who needed what they carried. The Ashen One turned away from Gael's body and walked into the wasteland. They carried the final remnants of the forbidden law as a simple vial of blood. The power that had been divided among all of humanity since the dawn of the Age of Fire was now contained in something small enough to fit in a pocket. The painter would receive her pigment. A new world would be born from the ashes of the old one. But that was a story for another time. Here, at the end of everything, there was only silence and ash and the body of a slave knight who had finally completed his mission in the worst possible way. The Dark Souls Chronicle had reached its conclusion,